Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Tom Clancy's The Sum of All Fears for PC, GameCube, and PlayStation 2. There's also a version of the game available on GBA, but it's a completely different style of game, so I'm not going to be covering it here. And of course, what you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person tactical shooter developed by Red Storm Entertainment and published by Ubisoft in 2002, first for PC, then later on for PlayStation 2 and GameCube, although the PlayStation 2 version was never released outside of Europe. The GBA version was released in the middle of all of that, but it's a top-down, more arcadey style of shooter, so it's not really something that's going to factor into this review. As for the PC, PS2, and GameCube versions, they were generally pretty mixed in their reception. Some people really liked them, but most people seem to think that it was either mediocre, or in the case of the GameCube version, it's generally pretty reviled. Now, I don't have the GameCube version myself, so I can't confirm or deny those claims of the GameCube version being terrible, but I have seen some gameplay footage of it, and it does look pretty rough. It's pretty obvious that they developed the PC version first, and they ported it to the other systems, and didn't exactly do a particularly good job of that. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and actually start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether it's something of a forgotten gem or something else entirely. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice if you're familiar with other Tom Clancy games of the era is that it runs on the same engine as Ghost Recon, with a lot of the same interface elements and the same general visual style, although you're dealing with a lot more corridors, a lot more close quarters combat in this than the more wide open environments you saw in Ghost Recon. But while it's certainly a similar visual style to Ghost Recon, and they do reuse some of the assets here and there, most of the time that shift from more wide open combat to close quarters combat is actually a detriment, because it means that you're dealing with a lot more tight corridors, you're dealing with a lot more enclosed spaces that don't really give the engine an opportunity to shine, and you end up with some pretty low-res textures, certainly decent enough for when it was released, but it really has not aged well, and the fact that pretty much everything in this game, except for maybe 2 or 3 levels, is just these brown and gray corridors, just means that it's boring to look at. Add to that a rather low FOV, which, while probably sufficient for a 4:3 resolution, is not sufficient for one of the widescreen resolutions, even though the game does natively support widescreen, and you end up with visuals that are not only bland and boring, but can actually induce a headache over time if you're playing on a widescreen display. And of course, it goes without saying, if you're looking at it from a modern perspective, it looks extremely dated and does not hold up well. And then you move over to the sound design, you find it reuses pretty much every sound effect from Ghost Recon, and throws some fairly cheesy and pretty inconsequential voice acting in on top of that, and it just ends up sounding like more of the same, which is not necessarily a problem if this were just a Ghost Recon expansion pack. Instead, it's a full standalone game, and it just seems lazy. They did at least add some original music to the game, and it's definitely in keeping with what you hear from the early Rainbow Six titles and, of course, Ghost Recon, but it's nothing you haven't heard before, and in this particular game, it's just not used particularly well. While it is certainly decent music, it's just not really all that memorable, and it ends up really not doing the game any favors. So at least in terms of presentation, it ends up coming across as a hastily slapped together Ghost Recon expansion that ended up becoming its own standalone game, and given the general quality of Red Storm games in the past, that ends up being rather disappointing. But here's the thing, even if the presentation is disappointing, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. Although, this being a relatively early Tom Clancy game, it means that the story is not really all that important, and it's more about the gameplay. The basic story here is that you play as a 3-man squad who is operating as part of the hostage rescue team, and you end up being recruited by John Clark in order to track down the group responsible for the attack in the Sum of All Fears movie. The thing is, while the game is loosely based on the movie, and the movie is loosely based on the book, they actually don't really have all that much to do with one another. Sure, you're running tactical operations to take the group that was responsible for the movie's events down, but it basically treats the movie's events as background information to kind of give you a vague sense of why you're doing what you're doing, and just going around and annihilating entire swaths of bad guys. There are almost no cutscenes in the entire game, and those that do exist are pretty awful, and when you actually go into the missions themselves, they don't really have all that much to do with one another. They're really just individual operations that you're going on that really could just be standalone missions if they weren't very loosely tied together by what paper-thin plot there is. And you might think with the plot being so weak, it might fall to the characters to bring things up, but your entire squad is full of completely interchangeable operators that have absolutely no personalities of their own, so it does ultimately fall to the gameplay to bring things up. And that's certainly not a problem, because Rainbow Six and Rogue Spear as well as Ghost Recon all managed that before this, so it ultimately becomes a matter of how well the Sum of All Fears manages to compensate for its lack of writing with its gameplay. Well, the first thing you notice is that while it is based on the same engine as Ghost Recon, and generally speaking a lot of the mechanics are pretty much the same as that, from the way that the weapons work, the way the equipment is swapped out, and that sort of thing, you do find that the actual command interface is definitely not the same, and is a bit closer to the likes of Rainbow Six. Instead of a full command map where you can order your 3 squads around, you actually only get control over your individual squad, and you can only tell them what to do in a localized area. To that end, your command interface is down in the bottom left corner, and you press a button in order to use your mouse to activate it, and that pauses the game when you do so. The commands themselves are quite simple and quite easy to get used to. You have one for kind of an open formation where your squad spreads out a bit more, or one for getting in closer in the formation. You have one for where your squad will either hold position or follow you, and you have one for the doctrine, whether that be just going in stealthily or going in on a full assault run. You can also give directed commands where you can point the crosshair at a door and order your squad to do one of 4 actions. Either simply open the door, open and clear, or you can order them to throw in a frag or a flashbang. It's a rather simple command interface, and it's rather easy to get used to, but it does also highlight the general lack of tactical options that the game gives you. It gives you just enough to where it's definitely still a tactical shooter, and you do still feel like you have all the tools necessary to complete the job, but it does feel like a step down from Rainbow Six, for example, or even from Ghost Recon. And if you were hoping for a Rainbow Six style planning interface where you can lay out exactly what you want everybody to do when you start the mission, that's just not a factor in the game. You go on a preset path, and all of your AI support squads go on their own specific routes. Sure, once you're in the mission, you can wander around the level however you see fit, but you do still have this one specific path laid out for you that's outlined on the mini-map down at the bottom. Speaking of the mini-map, you'll notice a red series of bars popping up as you look around, and that's actually showing you where the enemy's general location is. Theoretically, it's something that should help, but I never really found it all that useful. What I did find very useful, however, is the auto-aim system, which has been in the Rainbow Six games before. I mean, the original game and Rogue Spear, of course, had it. Rainbow Six 3 had it, but you could generally turn it off without too much consequence. And Ghost Recon had it, but you could turn it off without much consequence as well. With the Sum of All Fears, it's almost mandatory. Because so much of the game takes place in close quarters combat, you find that you really need to be very quick on your reactions because the AI is extremely quick to react and is pinpoint accurate from half the map away. In fact, it is so quick to react and it is so accurate that I found that turning on the auto-aim system was the only way I could get past certain sections, so I just ended up keeping it on the entire game. Even then, it didn't help as much as you might think. You'd think, oh, well, auto-aim, if the game's aiming for you, that makes the game incredibly easy. It actually doesn't, because the enemy can react quicker than you can most of the time. And even if the game puts the crosshair on the enemy for you, you still have to press the fire button yourself, and you still have to actually get some accurate shots in, because the game does have arbitrary inaccuracy, so that instead of firing exactly where you're aiming, it's going to fire in a very small cone around the spot where you're aiming, so you may not necessarily hit exactly where you're aiming every time. And of course, this being a tactical shooter more from the design school of Rainbow Six 1, Rogue Spear, and Ghost Recon, you really cannot take a lot of damage. You might be able to take a couple of pistol rounds, but a single rifle round will bring you down pretty much instantly, and that's assuming that the enemy just doesn't get a headshot on you immediately. So even if you look at the auto-aim as a crutch, it really doesn't help you out as much as you might think, and the game can still be a bit punishingly difficult at times. That's not to say that the enemy AI is amazing. I mean, they don't use particularly good tactics. A lot of times they'll rush you. They might try to throw a grenade at you, but ultimately it ends up bouncing off of a wall and just landing in their own room, meaning they need to take cover instead. But you generally find that the enemy AI is competent enough to at least pose a threat to you with their guns. This means a couple of things. First, you as a player need to be vigilant, you need to be quick on your reactions, and you need to be accurate. That's already been talked about. But it also means that your squad needs to be quick and it needs to be accurate as well. And that's where the real problem with the game lies. This is a tactical shooter where your squad is completely useless. Sure, you have the command interface, but most of the time they will outright ignore what you were telling them to do and just stand there doing nothing instead. It only seems to work if you're aiming at a door, and only if it's a closed door. If it's an open door, most of the time it doesn't seem to work, and if it's a doorway where there isn't actually a door to be opened, they just stand there dumbfounded as if they have no idea what you're telling them to do. Even if somehow your command to go in and clear a room does work, most of the time they'll just waltz right into the room and get themselves shot to pieces because they have about the reaction time of a tortoise, and even if they do somehow manage to aim at an enemy and shoot at them, a lot of times they'll just waste a bunch of ammo trying to hit them at all, and when they do finally hit them, they've taken damage themselves in the process. I have lost count of the number of times I have seen squad mates get stuck on the environment somewhere and just end up being completely separated from the player for very lengthy amounts of time. I have lost count of the number of times I have seen squad mates get bunched up in doorways and have absolutely no idea how to get through them. I've even lost count of the number of times I have seen squad mates completely ignore enemies in the room only to get themselves shot to bits because they're just not shooting back. It is utterly baffling. I mean, they even do things like this.
Another one down.
And those are only a few examples of the genius level AI that you're going to be encountering with your squad mates, and it just ends up being incredibly irritating. If you're playing a tactical shooter, you want your squad to be competent. You want them to be able to go into an area, get the job done, and then go in and mop up if necessary. And don't get me wrong, I cut older tactical shooters some slack because the AI back then wasn't necessarily very good, but they still did a good enough job of making sure your squad mates were accurate and quick on their reactions, and that's simply not the case with the Sum of All Fears. And it'd be one thing if they occasionally glitched out, where they might just get stuck on the environment every so often, but there are ways of fixing it, or if they are at a very odd angle and somehow they manage to just not notice an enemy before it's too late. That'd be one thing if it was occasional, but this is happening constantly when you play this thing, and it really does show the complete lack of polish in the pathfinding AI and the targeting AI in particular. But considering they can't even respond to basic commands half the time, it just means that your squad is completely worthless, and you've basically eliminated the point of making a tactical shooter. And even if you compare it to its predecessors, Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon, it's inferior in every conceivable way, not just in the AI, but also even in things as simple as the planning phases and in the loadout system. You get a selection of pre-made loadouts and you cannot customize them at all. You can only pick one and then just go into the battle with it. And then you find out very quickly that some of those loadouts are completely worthless. Pro tip: don't use shotguns in this because you'll basically never hit anything, and even if you do hit something, it won't do anywhere near enough damage to take down an enemy. Oh, you might think a shotgun would be great for close quarters combat, and ordinarily it would be, but in this particular game, they are completely useless and they will get you annihilated more often than not. And when you bring the entire package together, what you find is that you're dealing with not simply a mediocre tactical shooter, it is an outright bad tactical shooter. And there are so many other options out there, even when this game was released, that are better than it, that there's absolutely no reason to bother with the Sum of All Fears. If you want a good tactical shooter from around the time when this came out, go pick up Rogue Spear, go pick up Ghost Recon. Hell, if you want to push the time frame out a couple of years, go and pick up Rainbow Six 3 Raven Shield. It's one of the finest tactical shooters ever made. But just don't bother with the Sum of All Fears. It is not worth it. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.